Parker, thank you for your service. We'll now proceed under the 5-minute rule with questions. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Stefanik.
I want to echo the chairman. Thank you, Ms. Parker, for your extraordinary service and your courage for being here today. Mr. Turley, I want to start with you. The Twitter files laid bare for the American people what you correctly call unconstitutional, quote, censorship by surrogate. Matt Taibbi writes, quote, Twitter's contact with the FBI was constant and pervasive as if it were a subsidiary. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. What we know on the record so far shows a relationship that goes beyond this sort of informal exchange of ideas.
You're correct. In fact, isn't it true that leading up to the 2020 election, Twitter had weekly meetings with not just the FBI, with DOJ, with DHS, with DNI, to conduct this unconstitutional censorship by surrogate? We know that because of the Twitter files, correct?
Correct.
And it was not just meetings, not just censorship of stories like the Hunter Biden laptop story. We also now know that the FBI paid Twitter over $3.4 million of taxpayer funds to censor these stories before the 2020 election. Is that correct?
That money was paid. Twitter confirmed that.
And the Twitter files are just the tip of the iceberg because there's so much more. There was a corrupt revolving door at the highest levels between the FBI and Twitter. Look no further than Jim Baker, former general counsel at the FBI who helped unlawfully investigate Donald Trump in the 2016 election. Or look at Jim Comey's deputy chief of staff who became the director of strategy at Twitter. Isn't it true, according to the Twitter files, that there were so many FBI officials who then went to work at Twitter that created their own Slack channel and crib sheet for onboarding? The Twitter files confirm that, correct?
Correct.
Are you aware, as the American people are aware, that according to polling, of the people that were made aware of the Hunter Biden laptop story, 53% would have changed their vote, including 61% of Democrats. This is the definition of election meddling, and it's the definition of election meddling by the FBI on behalf of Democrats, paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. It's collusion, it's corruption, and it's unconstitutional. Ms. Parker, I want to go to you next about your experience at the FBI, because this is not just about the Twitter files, which folks are focused on because of the news it made. It's about a systemic rot in the culture and the politicization of the leadership of the FBI, and it needs to be rooted out. Let's take a step back. Let's look at the targeting illegally of parents who wanted to stand up for their kids at school board meetings. On September 29, 2021, the National School Boards Association sent a letter to Joe Biden equating parents at school board meetings to domestic terrorists. And on October 4th, Attorney General Merrick Garland issued a memorandum to the FBI and U.S. attorneys that the department would use federal enforcement tools to target and prosecute these parents. Do you consider parents as domestic terrorists?
I do not consider parents as domestic terrorists. No, I do not.
No, and neither do the American people. But there's more to this story. It goes back further than that initial letter on September 29th, because the letter didn't happen organically. It was solicited. It was solicited by the White House and by the Secretary of Education. Essentially, the Biden administration laid the predicate for which it used to justify illegally targeting the American people, targeting these parents. Is it proper protocol, as a former FBI officer, to set that predicate, to manufacture the reasoning to justify opening an investigation?
I believe that no one should be targeted for free speech and that violence should never be tolerated under any circumstance, but it should definitely not, no one should be targeted because they want to speak up at a school board meeting.
This was a setup. And it was the setup, and it's the real definition of weaponization of the government against the American people. And it's not just this example of targeting parents at School Boards Association. It goes back to the opening of Crossfire Hurricane. It goes back to the faulty FISA application. It goes back to what we heard on that first panel from Senators Grassley and Johnson. It goes back to the suppression illegally of the Hunter Biden laptop story paid for by the U.S. taxpayers. This corruption needs to be rooted out, and it's not just about protecting the U.S. Constitution. It is most importantly about protecting the American people from the weaponization of the federal government against them. Yield back.
Lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very interesting. As a parent of 5 children, I think having my rights as a parent is a very sacred trust, a very sacred trust. But Mr. Williams, would you say that having worked as a prosecutor, threats of violence against individuals is something that supersedes an individual simply being a parent?
Of course, Madam Ranking Member, threats of violence are actionable under the law. When they come, prosecutors can investigate, or the FBI or any other investigative agency can investigate them and prosecute as appropriate.
Sure. This one-page DOJ memo that we've made much ado about says in its first instance that the First Amendment protected activity should never be subject to prosecution, and issues a concern to illegal violence and threats of violence that are made to school board officials, most of whom are, surprise, surprise, parents, volunteers who do the unenviable job of trying to direct their children and their communities' activities with regard to education, a job most of us, thankfully, have not had to do. And I'm also troubled, I'm deeply troubled by all of the events, as well as the increase in violence and threats of violence against civil servants and federal law enforcement as we attempt to weaponize these individuals doing their job. In fact, we've seen the consequences of this rhetoric over and over again. I'm also deeply troubled by the idea of Congress, as I said in my opening statement, using oversight as a weapon to air a list of political grievances. We seem to hear much of that from the first panel, especially. I've been a member of the House Oversight Committee, where I saw firsthand how good oversight can help Congress make better public policy. Mr. Williams, you've worked in both Congress and the executive branch. Do you agree with me that oversight of the federal government is an important legislative process?
Absolutely. As Representative Raskin said at the first panel, the Constitution doesn't explicitly lay out an oversight mandate, but the legislative mandate of Congress provides Congress with its ability to engage in oversight. Oversight is good when it helps the government work better.
Thank you. Do you agree that congressional oversight is at its best when it's focused on addressing the real problems that Americans face on every day?
The real problems Americans face every day and making government work better, absolutely, Congresswoman.
I believe in congressional oversight, and committee Democrats would be willing to work together to conduct oversight of matters such as the disproportionate audits by the IRS of African-American families. Recent reports about former Attorney General Bill Barr and Special Counsel John Durham. Mr. Williams, do you agree that congressional oversight works best when it's bipartisan in nature?
Absolutely.
And have you seen examples of that in bipartisan investigations?
Oh,
I know that
absolutely.
it's so infrequent now, but have you ever seen any?
Absolutely. A great example is in 2016 when the House Committee on Oversight, led by Republican Chairman Jason Chaffetz and Ranking Member Elijah Cummings, worked together on an investigation, a bipartisan investigation of the United States Secret Service and mismanagement and misbehavior there. It led to bipartisan legislation that made, as I said, the government work better and Secret Service a more functional organization.
What about cooperation between the branches of government? Is it necessary for Congress to be willing to work with the executive branch in investigations?
Yes, and vice versa. Absolutely. The executive branch should be willing to work with Congress as well.
And would that first instance be trying to come to agreement as to when and how documents and information could be given?
Absolutely. The public sees hearings, but does not see that when the process works properly, there's a back and forth and a give and take between the two parties at both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, as I said before.
Would you say 2 weeks into the Congress issuing subpoenas might be a bit premature for the investigation and cooperation between those branches of government?
Certainly, Congressman, Congress has the authority to issue subpoenas quickly if they wish, but I guess you get more flies with honey than with vinegar, to be cute. And working with the other side collaboratively is always going to be a better approach.
Vinegar seems to work better on social media, though, than the honey. I yield back.
I think the gentlelady, I would just point out, we tried the honey. 100 letters we sent in the last Congress. We tried the honey.
The last
honey,
Congress,
the
you're
hon-
now
the honey,
the chair.
The honey didn't work.
You're now
That's why
in
we
the
sent
majority. You
subpoenas.
should have tried that first as the chair of this committee, not as the ranking member.
We tried. We
You didn't
tried
do
with
that as
100 and some
chairman.
letters.
You didn't.
The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the state of Wyoming, Ms. Hageman.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan. It is a privilege to serve on this select subcommittee, and I look forward to the work we have ahead of us. After over 30 years as a water, natural resource, and constitutional attorney, I have seen firsthand and fought against the weaponization of the federal government against my fellow Wyoming citizens and the country at large. Through the testimony of our witnesses today and the points made by my colleagues, it is clear that the culture and mission of the FBI and DOJ has changed in a manner which runs counter to the rights and liberties of the American people. The purpose of government is to secure our natural rights. Yet the testimony we have heard and the information received from the whistleblowers and other investigative findings has shown that the FBI's mission has moved from securing those rights to using them as a predicate for investigating and surveilling the American people and weaponizing their government structure against them. Mr. Baker, in a Wall Street Journal piece you wrote titled, "The FBI Needs a Ray of Courage," you stated that in response to Attorney General Garland's memoranda directing the targeting of American parents, Director Wray should respond by highlighting that the FBI won't undertake any investigation based on speech alone. It is troubling that that statement would even need to be made. But Mr. Baker, do you think your advice was heeded by Director Wray?
In fact, I remember that episode quite clearly. I wrote that article in October, just days after the announcement became public, and I was in touch with high executives at the FBI a day or two after that. They assured me that the FBI would maintain the standard of only investigating those situations where there was violence and not investigating free speech. I have to accept the ranking members of the FBI who told me that. However, my article in the Wall Street Journal still stands. We needed, the FBI needed, the American people needed to hear Director Wray say that publicly, as other FBI directors have spoke up to previous attorney generals and previous presidents, and he never did publicly. And the American people needed to hear, we wouldn't be having this discussion today if he clearly stated that we will not investigate speech, we'll only investigate violence. We're still waiting for that statement.
Okay. Mr. Turley, from what Mr. Baker just said, we have seen two issues stemming from this abuse and change of priorities within the FBI and DOJ. They are either investigating Americans based upon their constitutionally protected rights, or they are flagging lawful action to which they have political objection. In some of your recent writings, you have identified two very important points from the revelation of the FBI Twitter relationship. First, that this relationship is a First Amendment violation as it constitutes censorship by surrogate or proxy. And second, you also are concerned that you don't know what is more menacing, the role the FBI played in Twitter's censorship program or its response to the disclosure of that role. The Constitution is a limited governance document. The First Amendment identified our God-given right to speak freely and imposes restraint that the government shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Mr. Turley, can you explain the implications of the government relying on private industry to circumvent the First Amendment?
Thank you for that question. The Supreme Court and lower courts have spent a great deal of time trying to define when a relationship with a private party can cross over to a type of agency relationship. And that also applies on the state level through the 14th Amendment. In cases like Page, for example, you have situations where you have a government official who called an employer to say, I don't like what this person said in a public meeting, and that employee was fired. And the court said, you know, that is government action. That is a violation of the First Amendment. One of the things that this subcommittee has to deal with is that difficult line, and I admit it is difficult. But in these Twitter files, there's a very disturbing picture that emerges. You have regular meetings between the FBI and Twitter. They even offered to give clearances to Twitter officials. You have complaints among Twitter employees that this is overwhelming in terms of the number. And what you really see is how insatiable censorship becomes, that eventually they were doing what appeared to be word searches and just sending all of these postings in for possible action by Twitter. And that included things like jokes and other things that anyone looking at it would realize that this is not a nefarious Russian operation. So when we talk about surrogate censorship, we're talking about one of the most serious threats against free speech. You know, people always say, well, you know, the First Amendment only applies to the government. The First Amendment is not synonymous with free speech. It deals with one problem of free speech. What we're talking about with surrogate censorship is a much greater problem for those of us who value free speech as a defining right of this country.
I appreciate that. And one more point to make, they also paid Twitter millions of dollars.
Time has expired.
I will yield back.
Thank the gentlelady from Wyoming, and now I recognize my friend on the other side of the aisle, Mr. Lynch, who worked successfully and diligently with our late friend Walter Jones to secure the release of 28 pages of the 9/11 document. And now I recognize Mr. Lynch for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Williams, on August 12, 2022, the FBI and DHS released a joint intelligence bulletin warning of an increase in domestic terrorist threats against federal law enforcement officials following the search of Donald Trump's offices at Mar-a-Lago, including, quote, a threat to place a so-called dirty bomb in front of FBI headquarters and issuing general calls for civil war and armed rebellion. On August 9th, at Judiciary, GOP tweeted, the IRS is coming for you. The Department of Justice is coming for you. The FBI is coming for you. No one is safe from the political punishment in Joe Biden's America, close quote. And on that same day, my colleague, Representative Gosar, my Republican colleague, called the FBI, quote, the enemy of the people, and tweeted, we must destroy the FBI, close quote. Do you share my concerns as a former FBI employee about this type of rhetoric inflaming those who might already be inclined to do harm to our federal officers?
Mr. Lynch, above all else, I should take a moment to praise the work of the FBI and the many law enforcement agencies and individuals that I worked with throughout my time, 15 years in government, much of it in law enforcement. They do work on behalf of the American people and frankly don't sign up for threats or abuse. So to answer your question, no, absolutely, the threats hurt and are toxic and corrosive to our democracy.
Is it ever appropriate for American leaders to encourage violence against another branch of government?
The encouragement of violence is never appropriate either as a moral matter or under the law, sir.
Now, thank you. The FBI has to respond to facts on the ground. And as recently reported by the Bipartisan Center for Strategic and International Studies, 28 of the 30 domestic terrorism fatalities that occurred in 2021 were the result of far-right terrorist attacks perpetrated by individuals who were, and I'm quoting, motivated by ideas of racial or ethnic supremacy, opposition to government authority, including perceived overreach related to protocols following the COVID-19 policies, misogyny, hatred based on sexuality or gender identity, and belief in QAnon conspiracy theory or opposition to certain policies such as abortion. Mr. Williams, could a congressional investigation designed to spread misinformation suggesting that the government is a threat actually compromise the safety of American citizens?
The important words there were designed to, and so of course a congressional investigation that were designed to do that would be improper, sir.
As you've raised as well, I was on the committee when Mr. Chaffetz and our dear friend Elijah Cummings conducted those negotiations around investigations of the Secret Service, and I also agree with the former chair's instructions around our joint investigations with Walter Jones. But could congressional investigations predicated on anti-law enforcement rhetoric contribute to misinformation that could lead extremists to target government actors?
Yes, sir.
Explain that. Go into that a little bit, rather than yes or no. Someone
sure.
who sat in that seat. Explain to the audience.
Sure. I think a lot of it's the climate we're in today. There is a significant risk of harm to an individual when people are whipped up by what they read and see. And so certainly these aren't mere statements. In addition to being legally actionable, they come at a significant cost, sir.
At the same time, a unilateral, this committee is based on the premise that that the American people are under attack by the federal government, by Department of Justice, by the FBI, by the Department of Homeland Security. That's the premise on which this committee was based. And I just regret the impact that that's going to have on people who might otherwise consider serving in those agencies, and I just wonder if you have a perspective on that as well.
Again, as I said briefly before, people come to, and in my experience, the vast majority of people I worked with, and frankly, if not all of them, came to serve, came to treat the rule of law as their guide and serve the American people. The fear of threats will chill people's ability, number one, to do their jobs, but also in terms of recruiting. People will not want to sign on for a job that will come necessarily with being threatened or doxxed online, sir. So I absolutely agree with that statement.
Thank you. My time is expired.